Spring 1912, the largest ship ever built set sail on its maiden voyage and never returned. Its name was Titanic. But what if the story we've been told isn't the whole truth? Have you ever wondered which insurance company deemed the Titanic too risky to insure? Who might have orchestrated its downfall? And why? Who were the people sent to their deaths? And who survived only to vanish from history? Witnesses claim to have heard explosions from within the ship and saw a phantom vessel silently watching Titanic's final moments. And what really happened to the Chinese survivors whose story remained hidden for decades? This is a story that ultimately reveals something incredible, a story you think you've heard, but haven't. It's a story that exposes what people still remain silent about today. This isn't just a tale of tragedy. It's a story of power, greed, and hidden interests that have shaped the world we live in now. Stay with us until the very end. Subscribe and stay tuned. The truth is just beginning. Did you know that 14 years before the Titanic disaster in 1898, an American writer named Morgan Robertson published a novel called Futility, the story of a luxurious ocean liner named Titan? He described it as an unsinkable marvel of technology. On its maiden voyage in April, the Titan strikes an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sinks because there aren't enough lifeboats. Over 2,000 people perish. 14 years later, Titanic, a ship almost identical in size, status, and fate, repeated the exact same scenario, down to the smallest detail. Name, route, number of passengers, even the month of the disaster. Everything matched. What are the chances that something like this could match by pure coincidence? Imagine this. You have a 10-digit phone number. You throw 10 dice, and each die must land exactly on your number's digit in the very first try. That's the probability that the events of Futility would align so perfectly with the Titanic disaster. Impossible. So, could the book have provided someone with the perfect blueprint for the fraud of the century? Behind the Titanic stood a man whose name was synonymous with power. They called him the banker of bankers. J.P. Morgan, banker, industrialist, and visionary. At the time, Morgan was working toward his greatest project, the creation of the Federal Reserve System, a central bank that would control the American economy. This idea also had powerful opponents who fiercely opposed it, believing it would one day become a tool to enslave freedom. Today, a century later, we can see whether they were right. But it is worth noting a very interesting fact. Morgan, owner of the White Star Line, the company that possessed the Titanic, was supposed to be on that maiden voyage, but he canceled at the last minute. Along with him, several wealthy industrialists and financiers who supported the creation of the Federal Reserve also failed to board. In contrast, 3 of their most influential opponents, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Strauss, and John Jacob Astor IV, were on the ship, and they died. Astor, then believed to be the richest man in the world, was an open critic of the idea of a private central bank. Their deaths, Morgan's sudden cancellation, and the fact that all of them belonged to the same financial elite, for many served as proof that Titanic's sinking was not a mere accident, but a cold, calculated act. What most people don't know is that RMS Olympic, Titanic's sister ship, built a year earlier in 1911 by the same company and under the same ownership, was nearly identical in appearance, so similar that ordinary passengers could hardly tell them apart. Shortly after launch, Olympic suffered a serious collision with the British naval vessel HMS Hawke. The hull was damaged and repairs were costly. After the collision, the British Admiralty Court ruled that the Olympic was at fault, as it had sailed too close to the warship and caused a suction vortex that drew the Hawke in. Because of that verdict, the insurance company refused to pay compensation to White Star Line, owned by J.P. Morgan, as the ship was deemed responsible for the accident. This gave rise to claims that White Star Line switched the names of the ships, that it was, in fact, the damaged Olympic that was deliberately sunk under the name Titanic in order to collect the massive insurance payout. Some believe it was J.P. Morgan's revenge against the insurance companies that refused to cover the Olympic's damages, for he was a man who knew no mercy in business. Although there is no solid proof, certain details simply don't add up. The number of portholes, deck layouts, and small structural differences in photographs from 1912 match the Olympic far more closely than the Titanic. Titanic was insured for £1 million sterling, roughly $140 million today, through the London market by the broker Willis Faber and Company on January 9, 1912. Over 70 insurance companies participated in the coverage, joining forces under Lloyd's of London to handle such an enormous sum. However, the Rothschild family, through their Alliance Assurance Company, refused to participate, citing that the ship was not safe enough. Later, some claimed they knew in advance what would happen due to their ties to international banking plans, though, as always, no evidence exists. Perhaps J.P. Morgan didn't want to make enemies of the Rothschilds, who at that time were far too powerful to become his victims. After the tragedy, insurers quickly paid the full amount, the equivalent of $130 to $140 million today. It was the largest maritime insurance payout in history up to that time, and it was completed within 30 days. A record speed. But how exactly did Titanic sink? There are many ambiguities and strange details surrounding that night. The lookouts on the Titanic did not have binoculars. The key to the locker containing them had been forgotten by Officer David Blair, who was reassigned shortly before departure. Without binoculars, the iceberg was spotted too late. Had it not been tragic, it would almost be laughable to embark on such a voyage with so many lives at stake, all because no one wanted to break open a lock. Perhaps, though, this was part of a carefully constructed story meant to support the official explanation. That same night, several survivors testified to hearing unusual sounds just before the Titanic began to sink. They described them as deep, dull thuds, as if something exploded, or as if a torpedo struck the hull. Engineer Frederick Barrett reported that something shook the entire ship violently, multiple explosions followed by a piercing metallic sound. Passenger Eva Hart, then a child, later said in interviews that her father clearly heard a series of loud, distinct bangs before the ship began to tilt. Sailor Edward Smith, near the bow, claimed he felt several blows, not one single scrape like ice, but more like detonations coming from within. Official investigations dismissed these claims, explaining that the explosions were actually the sounds of steel bulkheads cracking as the hull gave way under water pressure and structural stress. Yet, some engineers and researchers noted that the intensity and frequency of the sounds described by witnesses did not fully match the typical noise of steel rupturing, but rather resembled internal boiler explosions, or, as some theorists suggest, deliberately placed charges. Interestingly, the first fractures and damages appeared exactly where the Olympic had been struck in its previous collision with HMS Hawke, fueling suspicion that it was, in fact, the same ship lying on the ocean floor. Several witnesses from the engine rooms later disappeared or were never called to testify before official commissions, furthering speculation that certain parts of the story, especially about the series of explosions, were deliberately suppressed. Official inquiries maintained that these were merely the sounds of steel plates giving way under water pressure, but many remained convinced that something far more sinister had occurred than a simple collision with an iceberg. What is still rarely mentioned is that at the exact moment Titanic struck the iceberg, April 14, 1912, at 11:40 p.m., crew members and survivors reported seeing lights from another ship nearby, perhaps only 8 to 10 miles away. That ship never responded to distress signals or offered help, as if it were merely there on some mission that was already completed. Its name was SS Californian. The SS Californian was a smaller cargo passenger ship owned by Leyland Line, which, interestingly, also belonged to J.P. Morgan through his International Mercantile Marine Company, the same group that owned Titanic. That night, the Californian was sailing from London to Boston and stopped in the North Atlantic after encountering an ice field. According to its crew, around 10:30 p.m., the ship halted because of ice, some 10 to 20 nautical miles from Titanic, and observed distant lights. Around 12:45 a.m., Titanic fired distress rockets, but Californian did not respond. Its captain reportedly thought it was a celebration, and the radio operator was asleep. Titanic sank around 2:20 a.m. Californian didn't move until 5:30 a.m., by which time the Carpathia, about 31 nautical miles away, was already rescuing survivors. The only ship that responded and saved passengers was Carpathia, though the Californian, being much closer, could have saved hundreds. Both British and American inquiries, 1912 to 1913, confirmed these facts beyond doubt. Captain Stanley Lord and his crew were criticized for inaction, though no legal punishment followed. Lord's reputation was ruined, and his passivity became one of the greatest mysteries, sparking the theory that the Californian was on standby as part of J.P. Morgan's insurance operation, perhaps even monitoring the sinking. What most people also don't know is that 8 Chinese passengers were aboard the Titanic, all third-class travelers seeking a better life in America. Third class had almost no chance of survival. Their quarters were deep below deck, far from lifeboats. Yet 6 of the 8 survived, a statistical rarity. The survival rate for third-class passengers was only 25 to 30%, but for these Chinese travelers, it was 75%. However, the U.S.-Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 prohibited Chinese laborers from entering the United States. Even though they survived the icy Atlantic, they had no legal right to enter America. They were secretly deported, and their names were erased from official lists of survivors who arrived in the U.S. Whether they played a special role in the story or were merely men seeking a new life, we may never know. And finally, something most haunting of all. In a bizarre twist of fate, Wendy Rush, the great-great-granddaughter of Isidore and Ida Strauss, who perished on the Titanic, was the wife of Stockton Rush, CEO of OceanGate, the man who died in 2023 aboard the Titan submersible while descending to the wreck of the Titanic with several crew members. According to available sources, OceanGate's Titan had completed approximately 90 dives before the fatal one. The mission had multiple goals: to study the wreck and capture high-quality 3D imagery for scientific and documentary purposes, and to offer an extreme exclusive experience, a direct encounter with history's most famous ship. However, some participants reportedly wanted to verify the theory of the ship swap, to prove that what lies at the bottom of the Atlantic might not be the Titanic, but the Olympic. This opens the unsettling question of whether the submersible might have been sabotaged by those who did not want the truth to surface. It's as if the curse of the Titanic carried across generations, linking the tragedies of 1912 and 2023. And finally, take a look at the most important detail. These are the original footage of the Titanic, captured just before its maiden and final voyages. Here, we also have footage of the Olympic. We leave it to you to compare and judge for yourself. Which ship now rests at the bottom of the Atlantic? Subscribe and stay tuned. The truth is just beginning.